as part of the strategy of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, of the New York intellectuals, of attacking the left from the left, you invert reality. You make your enemy seem like what you are. You accuse your enemy of what you truly are, because it's the imperialists who are conservative. It is the imperialists who are against art and culture. It is the imperialists who are for violence. But all of those claims, they have latched on to the Cuban government and made it seem that the Cuban government is promoting all of those things. Today, we're going to focus on US influence on Cuban hip hop and the ongoing protests. This presentation is largely going to focus on, obviously, we're going to start off with what's happening in Cuba. We all obviously know what's going on with the US attempted color revolution, the protests that seem to be woke, seem to be hip with the youth in mainstream media, but in reality, we know them to be something very different. And I want to kind of focus in on this attempt by US imperialism to use media, the arts, culture for regime change operations abroad, because I think this is something that transcends Cuba. This style of imperialism, of attacking the left from the left, of using art and culture and music, subverted art, culture, music, to attack anti-imperialist governments is something that has been used in Nicaragua during the 2018 protests, has been used in Venezuela several times and several coup attempts, has been used against the Soviet Union, as we'll go into in a bit, has been used against China. And it forms part of a broader strategy of US imperialism and regime change that transcends Cuba. So although obviously part of this will focus on the US influence on Cuban hip hop, I think it's important to really give a political education, a history of what this new strategy of imperialism is all about, because that's the only way that we'll be able to prevent it moving forward. So I want to start off by reading a quote from Víctor Jara. He was a Chilean Communist Party member, revolutionary guitar singer, an amazing artist who created socialist music, some of my favorite socialist music. If you haven't gotten a chance to check out his music, check him out, Víctor Jara. He was brutally murdered by the Pinochet fascist dictatorship after the 1973 coup in Chile. And he said, quote, US imperialism understands very well the magic of communication through music and persists in filling our young people with all sorts of commercial tripe. With professional expertise, they have taken certain measures. First, the commercialization of so-called protest music. Second, the creation of idols of protest music who obey the same rules and suffer from the same constraints as the other idols of the consumer music industry. They last a little while and then disappear. Meanwhile, they are useful in neutralizing the innate spirit of rebellion of young people. The term protest song is no longer valid because it is ambiguous and has been misused. I prefer the term revolutionary song. So this quote is from 1969. The height of the quote unquote summer of love, of MK Ultra, of Woodstock, the birth of the hippie movement, the new left, the synthetic left, that hijacks music, that hijacks protest songs for regime change, for imperialism. And again, 1969, this is very early on. Víctor Jara, as a communist singer who pioneered this genre of nueva canción, along with many other women, especially in South America, is talking about the use of music and art and culture for regime change and imperialism. So I think that quote is still very relevant today. And of course, as we're seeing being played out in Cuba today with the so-called San Isidro movement, the so-called protest hip hop movement. And that's something to keep in mind. The two or three main points I want to focus on today is, first, the US has been and continues to finance art, culture, and music as a strategy for imperialist regime change. And we'll go into some of the key historical timelines to back up this claim. Second, the US imperialism has been funding Cuban anti-government musicians for years, not just recently, but for many years. And third, the recent protests in Cuba were largely sparked by anti-government US-backed musicians. And it's interesting because me and Comrade Oni did a podcast a few weeks ago, right before the protests started coming up. It was about the San Isidro movement, about hip hop, talking about that very same topic, about hip hop being weaponized for US imperialism. Lo and behold, 2 or 3 weeks after that conversation, not saying that we started in any way, but right after that, out of nowhere, the protest jump started as if it were a sleeper cell, originating from that very same San Isidro where this hip hop quote unquote movement was being financed. So it's very interesting that after this hit song called Patria y Vida, which we can start talking about in a bit later on, about the false dichotomy that was created by that, how after the release of that song was basically a launch point, a testing ground for regime change. And that's really what it was about. So we'll get into talking about that toward the end. But first, I just want to start off by giving everyone a little bit of history about this strategy of using music, art, culture for imperialist regime change. And for that, we have to go back to the year 1950. 1950, the US Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, creates the Congress for Cultural Freedom. What is the Congress for Cultural Freedom? It was a self described advocacy group for anti communism. At its height, it was active in 35 countries, and it sought to challenge what they described as post war sympathies with the Soviet Union of many Western intellectuals, particularly among liberals and the non communist left. It was created in response to the Soviet Union's World Congress of Intellectuals in Defense of Peace, which was established 2 years earlier in Poland, 1948. So basically, in 1950, the US CIA is like, look, we need to get artists, cultural figures, musicians in our side, inside of capitalism and imperialism. Because what's the context? 1950, post World War II, socialism and communism is extremely appealing to millions of people around the world. The Soviet Union defeated the Nazis. Communist parties all over Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean, the Middle East, all over the world have some of the highest numbers. And not just even in terms of rank and file membership, but top political, ideological, cultural figures joining major communist parties. So communism 1950 was at its height at this time period. So Congress of Cultural Freedom, the US takes a new strategy. Up until this point, the US imperialist strategy had been to scare people away from communism, to say that communism is radical, to say that communism will completely change all of society, will undo everything that already exists. And this message was very appealing to a lot of people who were exploited and oppressed around the world, and actually pushed people toward communism. And so the strategy was flipped, where instead of portraying communism as revolutionary, as groundbreaking, they portrayed communism as gray, as colorless, as dull, as totalitarian. And they portrayed the West as colorful and youthful and full of art and full of culture. And that's where we get a lot of these stereotypes about Soviet architecture being gray and being dull and being all uniform. And the same thing with clothing. So that was all part of this Congress for Cultural Freedom, 1950. One of the key figures of the Congress for Cultural Freedom was a man named Irving Kristol, who is known as the godfather of neoconservatism. And he was part of a small but vocal anti-Soviet group that became known as the New York Intellectuals, which were a group of writers and literary critics based in New York City who were part of what was called a Young People's Socialist League that was affiliated and allied with Trotsky in the split against Stalin and the Soviet Union. And they were completely backed by the CIA. This is public record. And if you even go to the CIA.gov website of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, you'll see the connections that the CIA had with a lot of these groups, the Young People Socialist League, Socialist Party USA, that were attacking that, they sought to integrate literary theory and art and culture with socialism while still rejecting Soviet socialism as a political model. So these are people who were claiming to be leftists, who were claiming to be socialists, but were vehemently anti-Soviet, saying that the Soviet Union was a dictatorship. It didn't allow for creative freedom. And so they formed the New York Intellectuals. They formed the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which included key writers like Hannah Arendt, Elian Cohen, Morris Dickstein, Clement Greenberg, Paul Goodman, Sidney Hook, Irving Howe, Seymour Martin Lipset, and many others in writing countless journals, magazines, and Ramparts magazine actually had a big expose about the Congress for Cultural Freedom, laying out a lot of the magazines and artists who were backed by the CIA created group. So 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, you have the growth of quote unquote leftists and artists who were backed by the CIA, who were used as puppets for regime change operations around the world. 1961, another key date, the US creates the Agency for International Development under Kennedy. And this is a program that was created for administering what they call civilian foreign aid and development assistance. With a budget of over $27 billion, USAID is one of the largest official aid agencies in the world and is one of the agencies that is responsible for the regime change operations going on in Cuba today. And part of USAID's work is to provide funding for NGOs in countries that they deem as, quote, promoting civil society. And USAID, curiously enough, was founded in 1961, just a few months after the Sino-Soviet split in 1960 between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, where Henry Kissinger and the new evil geniuses at the helm of US imperialism realized that in order to defeat the left, in order to defeat the Soviet Union, you had to attack socialism from quote unquote the left. And in some cases, this meant siding with ultra leftists and people who claimed to be left, but really were serving the goals of imperialism to attack them. And so that was part and parcel of this strategy. 1983, another key event, US creates the National Endowment for Democracy, another one of the organizations that is responsible for regime change and hip hop, supporting hip hop, quote unquote, movements in Cuba. This is, of course, under Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan appointed a man by the name of Carl Gershom, who is the NED's first and only president who's still in power today. And Carl Gershom was also part of the New York Intellectuals. He was the executive director of the Social Democrats USA from 1975 to 1980. He was previously an officer for the Young People's Socialist League, again, another Trotsky-affiliated, quote-unquote, leftist group that opposed the Soviet Union and received backing and funding from the Central Intelligence Agency. And Carl Gershom also worked for Israeli intelligence organization. I'm going to totally butcher the pronunciation of this, but I'm going to give it a shot. B'nai B'rith International, which is a Mossad-linked intelligence organization created by Israel to understand, to capture where people are culturally around the world and use that in their regime change efforts. And today, the NED runs programs in more than 90 countries, including Cuba. And the NED recently played a role in supporting the Arab Spring of 2011. And since 2004, the NED has granted, interestingly enough, in China, just to give the example to contrast it with another socialist country, another country building socialism, China, has granted over $8 million to Uyghur groups in China, including the World Uyghur Congress, the Uyghur Human Rights Project, the Campaign for Uyghurs, and the Uyghur Transitional Justice Database Project, as well as Chinese dissidents like this guy, I'm going to mispronounce his name as well. My apologies, Ah Weiwei, a bunch of postmodern artists in China who oppose the socialist realism, oppose revolutionary art. And this is interesting because as a socialist myself, as a leftist, one of the main tenets of socialist art and culture is making art accessible and understandable to all, making the working class the protagonists of your art, and having art that embodies the revolutionary spirit of the people in a simple and easy to understand way. And a lot of the art that was promoted by the Congress for Cultural Freedom in the Soviet Union, in the People's Republic of China, and in Cuba and in other socialist countries was postmodern, was deconstructive, was against socialist realism being the dominant socialist form of art and culture that was promoted in the socialist countries, that was very simple. It had very simple messages of uplifting the working class, uplifting historically marginalized communities, women, LGBTQ people, working class, peasants. And this postmodern art that was financed by the Congress of Cultural Freedom promoted individualism, focused more on freedom of speech and expression and abstract nonsense that we see today. So that's sort of the background of the overall strategy of the Congress of Cultural Freedom, of the US AID, of the CIA supporting music and hip hop and art around the world to destabilize enemies. Now, going into specifically the example of Cuba, Cuba has been obviously a target of US imperialism for many years since the Cuban Revolution itself. And the US destabilization attempts against Cuba have entered into very different periods, unique periods. And between 1960 and 1990, one of the most marked strategies of US imperialism and attacking Cuba, the main targets of this regime change destabilization, the main agents of this were the right wing, predominantly white gusanos in Miami who were overtly Republican, overtly fascist, overtly right wing, who were part of paramilitary groups that were training death squads in other countries, that were smuggling drugs. And these were people who, from the very beginning, the US had very close ties with and were unabashed about their connections to the CIA. Obviously, this did not fare well for their branding. The Cuban government garnered a lot of solidarity and support from oppressed and colonized people in the US and around the world because seeing the class contradiction and the national question so clearly made it so obvious that anti-government dissidents in Cuba were overwhelmingly rich, were overwhelmingly wealthy, white landed elites who were kicked out after the Cuban Revolution. 1990s, the special period, Soviet Union was forcibly dismantled by US imperialism. Economic crises, Cuba enters a special period where there is increased turmoil on the island because of imperialist destabilization. The strategy begins to change. You have 1998, a project, the Varela Project, that was started by Oswaldo Paya of the Christian Liberation Movement, MCL, was named after Felix Varela, a Cuban religious leader. So very slowly into the 90s, into the early 2000s, you have a branding shift, a change in strategy where instead of just financing these right-wing Miami-based death squads, the US imperialists began funding what they call, quote, civil society. And again, this all ties back to help and assistance from Carl Gershom, the New York intellectuals, these people who were already playing a role in attacking the Soviet Union and said, look, we're not going to destroy the communist movement with the right wing, with fascists. We're going to destroy it with social democrats and democratic socialists and human rights activists and hip hop artists. So that was exactly the strategy. And interestingly, in 2002, the Cuban government formed the Agencia Cubana de Rap, and this was a move by the Cuban government to recognize two things: a, the growth and popularity of hip hop at the time, 2002, skyrocketing in popularity in the United States, around the world, but also secondly, to uplift the role of the youth, to recognize that in order for the Cuban Revolution to continue to succeed, you need a new generation of artists, of cultural figures, of icons to pass the torch, to continue that revolutionary mission of the Cuban Revolution. And in order to do that, you need a new generation of artists. And so around this time period, the Cuban government is helping a lot of revolutionary artists in Cuba promote their music, to have TV shows, to have radio shows, to promote their albums from a socialist, anti-imperialist perspective. A year later, 2003, you have what is popularly called in mainstream media the quote unquote Black Spring, which they call the so-called crackdown on Cuban dissidents. And around this time period, 2003, during the Black Spring era in Cuba, this is when USAID, the NED, ramps up its funding of musicians, artists, and cultural spaces in Cuba in order to promote this idea that the anti-government pro-US figures are in favor of culture and music and the government is trying to crack down on that. So it's a complete inversion of reality, right? You have, even though in 2002, as I mentioned, the Cuban government is actively promoting, funding revolutionary Cuban artists to create hip hop, to have radio shows, TV shows, albums, all of these NGOs from the US come in swarming, creating these institutions to promote under what they call underground hip hop artists, to give the allure, the mystique of being revolutionary by calling it underground, by calling it independent, when in reality they're serving the interests of Wall Street and Washington. And so again, one of the main founders of this, the Black Spring, a lot of the people who were quote unquote imprisoned included musicians and artists, and the Cuban American National Foundation under Jorge Mas Santos supported the Varela Project and this growing generation of quote unquote underground hip hop artists. In 2009, a USAID contractor, Alan Gross, was arrested and sentenced to 15 years in jail for trying to establish an online network for Jewish people in Havana. Again, this was an attempt to try to use a marginalized or oppressed identity in Cuba to create something that was in favor of the U.S. empire, but with the appearance of being for an oppressed sector of society, so that the Cuban government can suppress it. And it's a bait and switch tactic that the U.S. imperialists have perfected up until this point. And in 2014, a very big development was made. It was revealed that the US financed a 4-year effort to promote Cuba's rap music scene as part of an effort to quote unquote promote democracy. The program ran from 2008 to 2012 on papers, on the books. It's still running today, but under a different name. And again, this was largely under the Obama administration, under the Democrats. And this is part of the USAID strategy to, again, promote what they describe as civil society and other human rights groups that promote art and culture. So you have this total shift in funding away from right wing, openly death squads, openly fascist groups based in Miami in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. That did not work out well for them. It looked horrible on a PR level for US imperialism. So they said, look, we need to switch our strategy. Let's fund arts, let's fund culture, let's fund music, because that's how we're going to appeal to the new generation of youth that didn't grow up after the Cuban Revolution. They didn't see what life was like in Cuba under Batista. They didn't see what that was like. And so by creating this seemingly revolutionary genre of music, we're going to influence a new generation of people. And that same year, 2014, when it was revealed that the US was financing millions and millions of dollars for Cuba's underground rap scene, it was also revealed that US created fake social media accounts, a fake Twitter-like site. I think it was called Zun Zun Zale or something like that, that was promoting regime change using SOS Cuba. The SOS Cuba hashtag, by the way, is not new. This didn't come out this year. It had been, they tried to use it. They tested the waters with that hashtag many years ago. It didn't work. This year, it seemingly took off, but that's something that is not new. Between 2017 and 2021, over 50 groups operated USAID or NED funded Cuba programs during the Trump administration. A sample of groups received $16 million in grants from USAID since 2017. And I want to list one of the main groups is a group called Creative Associates, which has connections to Panama, where we know the Panama Papers were exposed a few years back for having shell companies that finance shady businesses around the world. And Panama was where a lot of these groups had origins in. And the Creative Associates created a U.S. government financed social media network that I mentioned earlier. And the Creative Associates group is one of many that was created by the imperialists to try to fund hip hop artists. Some of them were Agora Cuba Incorporated, the Cuban Democratic Directorate, the Cuban Soul Foundation Incorporated, Cuba Net News, Echo Cuba, America's Relief Team, the Cuban Institute for the Freedom of Expression and Press. For example, in 2018, the Cuban Democratic Directorate, one of the groups I just mentioned that gets USAID NED funding, reported paying 746, quote, employees, agents, and contractors a total of $103,000. The group also reported paying $48,000 to $48,000 to over 1,900 people on the island. So a lot of the way that this works is that these US backed NGOs with shady connections around the world, shady funding, they'll contract artists and musicians, speaker fees, performance fees. If any of you have ever organized a concert or an event, if you're going to have somebody perform at your event, a lot of times you'll have somebody sign a contract, you'll agree to a price, you'll send an invoice. And that's how a lot of these quote unquote underground hip hop artists get their funding. It's not like they're staff members at these NGOs, but they get contracts, they get invoices, they get, they get charged for speaking at an event or performing at an event. And that's one of the ways that these NGOs are able to shift money around to these artists. And so that's some of the background on the US funding the Cuban anti government artists. This has been happening for many years, for decades, and it has taken several different phases throughout time. And most recently, the release of, just to kind of wrap up, the release of the song Patria y Vida, to give some context, historically, the slogan of the Cuban Revolution, Patria o Muerte, fatherland or death, when you decontextualize that slogan, it sounds crazy. And I had a conversation with somebody about this recently where they said, Patria o Muerte, that sounds so scary. It sounds so delusional, violent. And it plays into the imperialist lie that the Cuban government is violent, that the Cuban government is a dictatorship that just for no reason kills people out of nowhere, for no reason at all, just does that. And the context of that slogan, Patria o Muerte, obviously one of the slogans initiated by Ernesto Che Guevara after the US imperialist, the Bay of Pigs invasion, when the Cuban government, the US government was trying to overthrow the Cuban government, the Cuban Revolution, trying to invade the island, trying to overthrow the revolutionary government. And that slogan, Patria o Muerte, fatherland or death, was used as an anti-imperialist slogan to defend your country to the death, to defend the gains of the revolution, the gains for women's liberation, the gains for workers' rights, for campesino rights, to defend that to the death. And it is inherently a revolutionary slogan. Now, as part of the strategy of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, of the New York intellectuals, of attacking the left from the left, you invert reality. You make your enemy seem like what you are. You accuse your enemy of what you truly are, because it's the imperialists who are conservative. It is the imperialists who are against art and culture. It is the imperialists who are for violence. But all of those claims, they have latched on to the Cuban government and made it seem that the Cuban government is promoting all of those things. And that was a classic wordsmithing technique that was used in this very same operation, where you have individuals associated to the San Isidro movement, who, by the way, although are of Afro-Cuban background, doesn't necessarily mean that they're revolutionary or that they're in favor of the people, but their identities and their bodies and their image as Afro-Cubans was used in a way to try to portray them as being anti-government, to try to link it somehow to Black Lives Matter. And you'll see this as well on social media. You'll see people say Black Lives Matter in Cuba, fight racism in Cuba, overthrow the Cuban government, by taking an element of truth, right? Obviously, we're in favor of Black lives. We're in favor of the liberation of African peoples all over the world, not just in Cuba. But they invert it. They invert it for regime change, for imperialism. And that's what they did, not only by using those specific individuals in that music video, Patria y Vida, but also by inverting the slogan Patria o Muerte and using Patria y Vida to make it seem like they're the ones that are in favor of life, vida meaning life. They're the ones in favor of fatherland. So again, this is the strategy and the tactic, the mirror strategy that the enemy uses to attack not only the Cuban government and the Cuban Revolution, but all socialist, anti-imperialist movements around the world. And so it's no surprise that right after this track was released, which had a lot of anti-government slogans, imagery, just a few weeks after that, on a Sunday that nobody expected, from night to day, SOS Cuba comes out, all these quote unquote protests come out, and the photo op was perfectly curated to and timed for the release of that song. So to kind of wrap up here, just to say that the release of the song Patria y Vida, in my opinion, in my opinion, somebody who's been following this, was basically a alarm that the release of that song was saying, look, we're going to try the new regime change strategy now. And this forms part of the broader imperialist strategy of using hip hop, using music, using culture to attack the left, to attack the genuine anti imperialist left. And so I wanted to give this overview because it's going to keep happening. It has happened. This is not new. This is something 2021 is just a blink in the eye of the overall history of US imperialism using art, culture, hip hop, music to attack the socialist left. And so if by understanding the past, by understanding the history and analyzing the present, analyzing this Patria y Vida nonsense, analyzing the San Isidro quote unquote movement, we can prevent anything like this from happening in the future. And just to, as a side note as well, the same strategy was used in Nicaragua in 2018 during the 2018 protests, where you had music that was created by the Sandinista revolution in favor of Daniel Ortega, in favor of the revolution. They use those same songs, they change the lyrics to support regime change. Same thing in Venezuela as well. So this is going to keep happening, and that's why it's important to have this political education about the role of music, hip hop, culture in U.S. imperialism. So thank you so much.